Hello, my name's Julian Agyeman and I'm Professor of Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning at Tufts University in Medford, Massachusetts. I want to thank the Share City team for inviting me to give this keynote on inclusive food sharing futures. Before I start my remarks, I'd like to offer a land recognition. I'm talking to you now from Medford, Massachusetts, and I'm presenting on the traditional territory of the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts people. And I want to pay my respects to their elders, their past, their present, and their future, and commit to a principle of respect and care as part of this meeting. Earlier today, you heard from four presenters, Fern Edwards, Una Morrow, Brigida Maravelli, and Monica Rutt. And I went through their presentations and I was very impressed, but I pulled out four what I think are key points that I want to visit in various ways during my presentation. In terms of Fern's presentation, she looked at Barcelona, and I was really impacted by the concept of sharing beyond food, that we're sharing space, technologies, time, labour and skills. In Una's presentation on New York City, I again was impressed with the notion of sharing infrastructures, emergent infrastructures. What are these infrastructures that are being created through food sharing? In Athens, Brigida Maravelli talked about some case study work she'd done, and themes came out such as commensality, reimagining stigma, and a very, very important one for me, food with dignity. And finally, in Singapore, Monica Rutt's work was looking at some cultural issues, this notion of the kampung spirit, and the city in a garden and the smart nation idea that is happening in Singapore at the moment. So I want to pose, in addition to those points, some key questions I hope to illuminate on. Sharing beyond food, sharing as intercultural understanding. I want to also think about what does or what could dignified, inclusive food sharing look like in our intercultural societies. I also want to think about, can we imagine intercultural infrastructures for food sharing? And then finally, is inclusive food sharing smart food sharing? So let me start by thinking differently about food. I challenge my students to think as food not just as a set of molecules that offer nutrition and keep us going physiologically, but food as an intimate commodity, and food is part of food practices and what we call foodways. These are manifestations and symbols of cultural histories and proclivities. And as individuals, we participate in culturally defined ways of eating. We perform our identities in a sense, and we perform the memberships that we have in various groups. And so in this way, food informs individual identities, including shared racial identities. I want us also to think about food as belonging and becoming. And a very good example of this, I think, is a quote from two women who were based at the now defunct South Central Farm in Los Angeles, one of whom was a 30-year-old Zapotec woman who talked about her involvement in the farm in the following way. She said, "I planted this garden because it's a little space like home. I grow the same plants that I had back in my garden in Oaxaca, in Mexico. We can eat like we ate at home, and this makes us feel like ourselves. It allows us to keep a part of who we are after coming to the United States." Now, this for me really speaks to what I call the umbilical link that food performs in linking where we're from to where we are now, this idea of belonging and becoming. So not only have these women not only can they prepare culturally appropriate, culturally relevant foods, but if you look at the picture there, they've designed the garden in a way that mimics the garden they had back in their home in Oaxaca. So, in many ways, this garden is an autotopography. It is an inscription of their lives, their cultures, their identities onto the urban landscape. And just for those of you who don't know, South Central Farms was the biggest urban farm in the United States until its closure in the mid 2000s. It was 95% Latinx, and its loss is still felt by urban gardeners in the Los Angeles area. I don't think we can talk about inclusive food sharing until we think about what we mean by local. And moreover, I want us to contest this notion of the local. At the bottom of the slide, you'll see a picture of the now late George and his wife Julia Bowling from the Bowling Farm in Maryland. They were tobacco farmers. The state of Maryland is trying to get people out of tobacco farming. They're offering grants. And so George and Julia, being good US farmers, entrepreneurs, they decided to look around and think about, well, what shall we grow? And the signboard at the top of the picture is of the entry to their farm. They realised that there's 120,000 Africans, largely middle and upper middle class, living in the DC metro area, many of whom are doctors, professors, politicians, diplomats, and they want to eat locally grown African food. So what is local in an intercultural society? If the Africans want to eat local food, can we call that local? I find that too often the ecologically focused local food movement, the alternative food movement, will be very specific in what they consider a Maryland crop, or in my case, a Massachusetts crop. But as a geographer, I know that there is no such thing as local. Local is a relative relational term, and it's whatever we can persuade another person. So we can't say, oh, it's 50 miles or 100 miles from point X. Local means whatever people agree it means. And I think this is why it is a contested term. And so I want you to think more of local in terms of the idea of a cultural local. And if it is defined by the Africans as being local food, then perhaps we should be more reflexive and say, yes, that is local food. And a second very good example of this is some work that was done on Filipinos in San Diego. And they demonstrate what the author Jimenez Valiente Neighbors called translocalism. They carry with them in their migrations the idea that Filipino food is local food. They cook it at home, eat it in restaurants. They also tend their fruit and vegetable gardens in their yards and practice this idea of translocalism. And again, I think the discourse within the agri-food literature and the local food movement needs much more reflexivity. It needs much more inclusion if we are to build a bigger constituency for good food. Moving up to Canada, one of the most interesting things I found in doing some research was a paper by Gibb and Whitman, which talked about inclusive food sharing in terms of parallel local food networks in Metro Vancouver. Now, what's interesting is that up to 20% of farmers in the greater Vancouver region are Chinese Canadians. And because of a history of anti-Chinese racism in Canada, together with Chinese Canadian farmers' creative resistance and entrepreneurialism in response to social and economic change, the Chinese farmers have set up a parallel network of farm stands at roadsides and in communities that are local in the sense that they shorten the relationship between producer and consumer and place. But these networks, the Chinese networks, do not connect with the already established farmers market networks in the greater Vancouver region. Now, we can say that's good or that's bad, or why can't they all work together? This is the reality that we have. And what's very interesting for me is that I gave a talk similar to this in Vancouver a few years ago, and a Kenyan immigrant who was at the talk said, you know what, Julian, I buy my food from the Chinese farmer stalls because they grow the kind of food that I want to eat. So I think it's really important for us to think then of inclusive food sharing much more broadly, and move away from just the usual suspects when we look at food sharing to investigating what newcomers perceive as food sharing and their challenges to deeply held concepts that we might hold, like local food. Another example of inclusive food sharing in the US is refugee agriculture, and there are about 50 or so farms, but it's a growing number, 50 or so farms across the United States who are now acting as bases for helping newcomers, refugees, immigrants into agriculture in the United States. And in many ways, this is no different from the Scandinavians who settled the Great Plains a couple of hundred years ago. And my own university, Tufts University, has a farm called New Entry Farm, where the university and a community organisation help people to discover what can grow. In that particular farm, one of the largest immigrant groups are Hmong people, and it's a thriving learning space for both the Hmong people who are learning about agriculture in the United States, but also from other people, students from Tufts University, people from community organisations who want to learn more about ethnic food practices. So let me just reflect on some of the things that we've been talking about here. I really believe that we need to keep pushing the envelope, in a sense, if we want inclusive, intercultural, dignified and smart food sharing. And I think this lies in many issues, or there are many issues inherent here, but I think I want to pull out two especially. And one is this idea of values, a commitment to embedding equity, social justice, and diverse cultural identities from the start. Too often I find, not just in sharing work, but in sustainability work generally, we tend to get the economics, the technical issues, the environmental issues right. And if we can get to, and that's an important point, if we can get to equity and social justice through those other priorities, then we feel we've done a good job. That doesn't work. Social justice never simply happens. And it certainly isn't something we can get to. We have to bake it into our projects from the start. And when I think of one of the best examples in the world of a socially just food security system, I think of Belo Horizonte in Brazil, where the principles of social justice, food with dignity, and the Brazilian constitutional right to food were really, in the early 90s, baked into the food strategy that has become so famous. And now Francis Moore-Lappé calls Belo Horizonte the city that abolished hunger. That's quite a claim, but on all the measures that I've seen, it's a pretty fair one. And one thing that I do think that's interesting is that not only does the city have this commitment, but it actually puts it into policy and economic practice, such that the city sets the prices of certain essential foodstuffs that retailers can sell to people on benefits at. They can sell to other individuals at whatever price they can get. But fixing prices for certain foodstuffs ensures that people can eat and people can eat well. The other thing I think that really is inherent in the Belo Horizonte example is the notion of vision. The initial vision of the food security system for Belo Horizonte came about through the work of a mayor in the early 1990s, Patras Ananias, who was himself born into food insecurity. And it makes me wonder in some ways if our mayors have experienced some problem, are they going to be better at the resolution of that issue? The second thing I think that is inherent and very important to remember here is that that policy started in the early 1990s by a mayor who was in the Socialist Worker Party. Now, Belo Horizonte has had a succession of mayors since Patras Ananias, but nobody has dismantled this very popular food security system. The message here for progressive innovators in local sustainability is, if we get it right, it is really difficult for people of a completely different political persuasion to unpick a good process. A similar idea could be said for London's congestion charge. When Ken Livingstone implemented the charge, a lot of people said it wasn't going to work. It has worked. And then when Boris Johnson became mayor, he didn't unpick it. He was completely ideologically separated from the initial mayor, Ken Livingstone, but the congestion charge still stands. So I think values and vision are really, really important if we want to move the needle towards more inclusive food sharing. I just want to finish up with a shameless book plug. Many of you will know about my book, Cultivating Food Justice, Race, Class and Sustainability, co-edited with Alison Alcon. We are actually looking for, and here's a thought for some of you, we're looking for papers for a second edition of this book. MIT Press really want us to produce a second edition, so we will be announcing that fairly shortly. But I really want to plug my latest book, which I co-edited with a student from my food justice class, Sydney Giacalone. And this is the Immigrant Food Nexus, Borders, Labour and Identity in North America. And the impetus for this book came from, really from the election of the Trump administration in 2016 and their policy desire to get rid of undocumented immigrants. And we wrote an op-ed in the Boston Globe saying, does Mr. Trump understand that 50 to 70% of workers in the food chain in the United States are undocumented workers, and that if he carried out his plans, food prices would go through the roof. Now, that, of course, is not a good reason for not kicking out food workers, but we use the paper to offer an idea that really we cannot talk about immigration without talking about food, and we can't talk about food without talking about the role that immigrants have, not just as people without agency in the US food system, but people with agency in the US food system. The food truck workers, food truck workers and owners, the people who make their daily practices around food. So the book really is an exploration of what we are calling the immigrant food nexus. All I have to say is thanks very much. I wish this conference could have been in person, but the craziness of 2020 has obviously precluded that. I wish you all a great rest of the conference, and I'm looking forward to seeing all the presentations when they are finished. Thank you.